Orders of the day.
Private members' business, consideration of motion M422, last post fund in the name of Ms. Foote.
Ms. Foote, seconded by Mr. Casey, moves that in the opinion of the House, the last post fund is currently underfunded and excludes deserving veterans, causing unnecessary stress and hardship to families of veterans, and that the House call on the government to do the following. A. D'accepter.
A. Accept the recommendations of successive veterans ombudsmen calling for expanded and enhanced financial access to the last post fund.
Accept the advice from the Royal Canadian Legion made in the years 2008, 2010, and 2012, calling for expanded access and financial support for the last post fund. C.
Accept 3-year-old advice from departmental officials to expand and enhance financial access to the last post fund.
De souvenir. D. Review the last post fund's current burial assistance cap of $3,600 with the goal to establish a standard consistent with burial assistance provided to current members of the Canadian Forces. E. Review the means-tested standard applied to the last post fund that currently excludes many veterans with the goal to improve and lower the qualification standard to access the fund. And F. Provide stable long-term funding to the last post fund with the consideration given to establish a financial escalator tied to the Consumer Price Index. Debate. The Honourable Member for Random Buren St. George's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a Member of Parliament for Random Buren St. George's since 2008, it is indeed a privilege to introduce my second private member's motion in this House of Commons. My first motion addressed a serious issue, and that was the need for additional search and rescue services in Newfoundland and Labrador following the crash of Cougar helicopter that claimed 17 lives. This motion, M422, is very important as well and aims to enhance the last post fund to ensure that all veterans receive the dignified funeral and burial that they deserve. First, thank you to my constituents, including over 700 active Canadian Armed Forces personnel and many more retired veterans whose continued support enables me to present this important motion today. Thank you as well to all other veterans and active Canadian Forces members. Thank you also to the Royal Canadian Legion for your continued service, and to the Veterans Ombudsman, who first and foremost continues to defend the interests of all veterans. Special thanks to the Last Post Fund, which has served veterans and their families since its inception in 1909, and to Jean-Pierre Goyer, Executive Director of the Last Post Fund, for his outspoken advocacy. I would be remiss, Mr. Speaker, if I did not also thank the Liberal Veterans Affairs critic and Member of Parliament for Charlottetown for his continued dedication to veterans from coast to coast to coast.
Hear, hear.
The advocacy of all who you helped in the formulation of my motion. The Last Post Fund is an important program with the goal to ensure that no eligible veteran is denied a dignified funeral and burial, as well as a military gravestone, due to insufficient funds at time of death. Unfortunately, the Last Post Fund is far from ensuring that all veterans in need receive a dignified funeral and burial because the program is forced to apply outdated eligibility criteria. There are many cases in my riding and throughout the country where families of veterans who have either been denied by the Last Post Fund's outdated criteria or not received sufficient assistance were unable to pay for the total costs of a proper burial. In many of those cases, to help the family, the funeral home will cover the balance of the cost. Simply put, it is shameful for the government to treat our veterans and their families in this way, and to expect, in some cases, small businesses to absorb the additional costs when the family of the veteran is unable to do so. In drafting M422, I listened intently to suggestions on how to improve the Last Post Fund from various stakeholders, including the Veterans Ombudsman, the Royal Canadian Legion, and the Last Post Fund Administration. I sincerely appreciate the endorsement of the Royal Canadian Legion and thank the many Legion branches from throughout the country which have expressed support for M422. Prior to the budget being released, I wrote to the Minister of Finance and to the Minister of Veterans Affairs asking that the funding for the Last Post Fund be increased and that the financial criteria be updated to reflect today's realities. It goes without saying, Mr. Speaker, I was pleased to see the Finance Minister respond to my request that the financial assistance provided by the Last Post Fund be increased and that the amount available to qualifying veterans and their families went from $3,600 to $7,376 in Budget 2013. However, that will only help those who still have to deal, that will not help those who still have to deal with outdated eligibility when it comes to qualifying for assistance in order to ensure a veteran is able to be buried with dignity. So needless to say, I am disappointed the government chose to ignore the recommendations to expand access to the Last Post Fund and update the financial eligibility criteria. As I said before, if the Conservatives would agree to table this change in a separate standalone piece of legislation, free from contentious cuts to services that many veterans also rely on, I am confident they would find unanimous consent to pass it immediately. According to the Royal Canadian Legion, and I quote, "While the federal government has provided an increase to the funeral grant, the recent announcement does not address the accessibility to the program or its extension to low-income Canadian Forces veterans." End of quote. The reality is that by failing to expand access to the Last Post Fund, the government missed an opportunity to bring equality and fairness to all veterans. But it is not too late. Together we can fix this problem. Taking care of our veterans is not a partisan issue. It is our duty. There is no clearer message we can send than to stand behind our veterans, many who spent their military careers standing up for us, and we can vote yes to M422. Conversely, there is no clearer message to veterans that you do not support them than by voting no, since this is a standalone single-issue measure, unlike an omnibus bill or budget that might combine several conflicting issues. The Veterans Ombudsman released his first report entitled "Serve with Honor, Depart with Dignity" on February 19, 2009. In his report, the Veterans Ombudsman made 7 key recommendations in response to direct testimony from administrators of the Last Post Fund who described the challenges that some of the mourning families found when burying their loved ones. The Veterans Ombudsman recommends, and I quote, 1, that the ceiling for veterans' funeral and burial expenses be raised to reflect industry standards and that an indexing formula be introduced to ensure that the rates keep up with economic increases. 2, that the administration of funeral and burial benefits be simplified by using a discretionary lump sum approach for reimbursable expenses rather than the present itemized approach. 3, that Veterans Affairs Canada extend the funeral and burial program to all veterans. 4, that eligibility related to the funeral and burial program be extended to include veterans who suffer from multiple pension conditions where the total aggregate suffering and weakening of their body may contribute to the cause of death. 5, that the estate exemption, surviving spouse, for the means test be increased and align with present-day income and cost levels. 6, that Veterans Affairs Canada engage in a proactive, multifaceted communications campaign to raise awareness of the funeral and burial program. 7, that Veterans Affairs Canada be more flexible and allow for extraordinary circumstances to be considered when the established time frame is exceeded. End of quote. The 7 recommendations in that report, calling for the expansion and increased access to the Last Post Fund, were subsequently reissued by the current Veterans Ombudsman. M422 seeks the long overdue implementation of these suggested changes.
Hear, hear.
Last January, on the same day that I introduced my motion, the Royal Canadian Legion and its more than 330,000 members began a letter-writing campaign calling on the Conservative government to make 3 specific changes to the Last Post Fund so the families of all veterans can access the financial assistance they require to ensure their loved ones receive a dignified funeral and burial. First, they ask that the $3,600 rate provided by the Last Post Fund be increased. Second, they ask the government to grant equality to all veterans and stop excluding veterans who served after the Korean War from the Last Post Fund. Finally, they ask that the financial eligibility criteria be updated to reflect current income levels and the fragile economic climate. I am pleased to report that M422 addresses all of their concerns. Despite the Conservative government's own departmental officials and countless stakeholder organizations' recommendations to enhance access to the Last Post Fund, the government has failed to act. M422 also requests a review of the Last Post Fund's burial assistance cap to bring it in line with the burial assistance provided to current members of the Canadian Forces, which was included in the recent budget. I welcome the increase to this cap, but as I said earlier, increasing assistance without expanding access does nothing to ensure all veterans receive the dignified funeral and burial they deserve, since existing outdated eligibility criteria remain in place. From 2006 to 2012, under the Conservative government, over 66% of applications, which translates to 20,147 veterans, were rejected, and that is unacceptable. The current eligibility requirements applied by the Last Post Fund exclude all veterans who served post-Korean War from receiving any type of federal funding for a dignified burial and funeral. This means that veterans who fought in Afghanistan are not eligible to receive financial aid from the Last Post Fund. In the words of Jean-Paul Goyer, the Executive Director of the Last Post Fund, what is the difference between modern-day veterans that we send to Afghanistan and those who fought before them? The final eligibility criteria applied by the Last Post Fund is outdated because the financial eligibility criteria is outdated because of inflation and the current economic reality. The Last Post Fund states that in the case of a veteran with spouse or dependent children, to qualify, their combined net asset value must be $12,015 or less. This figure no longer reflects current income distribution levels within Canada and must be updated, Mr. Speaker. And that is why I'm calling on the House, calling on the government to support M422, which would be in the best interest of our veterans and their families.
Hear, hear. Questions and comments? Question et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Veterans Affairs, the Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for her sharing her party's views on the funeral and burial program. What is very surprising is to see a member from the Liberal Party stand and put forward such a motion. It was the Liberal Party, while they were in government, that drastically cut benefits under this important program. Nonetheless, our Conservative government will continue to stand up for our veterans. In fact, under the current program, more generous benefits are provided to our veterans and their families than our allies provide, more than that is provided by the United Kingdom, by Australia, by the United States. And now we've come forward with Economic Action Plan 2013, which will more than double the amount of funding available to our veterans and their families for funerals. I'd like to ask the honourable member if she and her party will vote in support of this important support for funerals and benefits in Economic Action Plan 2013.
The Honourable Member for Random-Burn, St. George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for her question, but isn't it just like the Conservative government to suggest that by voting against the Economic Action Plan, we'd be voting against veterans, when nothing could be further from the truth. We're giving them the opportunity to single out this, to vote for M422, so that we don't have to do an injustice to our veterans. By voting for M422, we could all be supporting our veterans. And isn't it just like a Conservative colleague to, in fact, go back 20 years and suggest that what the Liberals did was a disservice to our veterans? In fact, Mr. Speaker, according to a 2011 report by the Committee for Veterans Affairs, a committee controlled by a Conservative majority, including the Parliamentary Secretary for Veterans Affairs, in 1995, the estate exemption was decreased, and they quote, in an effort to return the program to its original intent. In other words, to provide burials for those who could not afford them. End of quote.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaires.
L'honorable député de
The honourable member.
Châteauguay. Excusez.
The honourable member for Châteauguay. Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would indeed like to ask my colleague a few questions. I thank her for having tabled this important motion that will indeed address certain issues. But I would like to mention from the start that my colleague from across the way, well, I would say that if there's a problem to access the last post fund, if we can say that there is a problem, it is because of the legacy of the Chrétien government that reduced these exemptions from 24,000 to 12,000. So I'd like to ask my colleague what amount would be an acceptable amount today. That $24,000 amount, which was in place in 1995, is this an amount that would be acceptable today? And I'd also like her to tell us if the amount that the increased amount within the Economic Action Plan, in other words, $7,300, would this be considered a significant enough amount to address these issues and the costs of these burials?
Limburn, St. George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I thank my colleague for his question. Whether or not the $7,000 figure is sufficient, it's unfortunate. I'm told that the government did not consult, in fact, with the last post fund when it came up with that determination with that figure, and that is unfortunate indeed. I do know that, of course, serving Canadian Forces members who pass away or who die, in fact, I think it's something in the vicinity of $17,000, anywhere from $13,000 to $17,000 is provided. The issue for me, Mr. Speaker, is to do whatever we can to increase the amount available to families so that what it takes to ensure our veterans receive a dignified funeral and burial is what this motion is all about. And again, we're talking about things that happened 20 years ago. I'm interested in the veterans of today. I'd like to think that all of us in this House of Commons are concerned about our veterans and their families.